Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants, and he joins us from Miami. Senator, what would you like to see change in US Cuba relations now?
Well, I'd like to see more of a democratic opening on the island of Cuba. Things like, I don't know, free press, stop putting people in jail because they don't agree with you politically, stop helping countries like North Korea invade UN sanctions, don't invite the Russians to open a military base 90 miles from our shores, allow independent political parties to be able to function. You know, the kinds of things that you find in virtually every country in the Western Hemisphere except Cuba and now increasingly Venezuela. That's what I'd like to see, and I'd like to see our foreign policy geared towards accelerating that.
President-elect Trump has called Fidel Castro a brutal dictator, but then he did not renew his promise to reverse President Obama's executive order reopening relations. He didn't talk about an embargo. So was that a sufficient response by your lights?
Yeah, it's no different than the one I put out. Look, I think what we need to do is understand our number one obligation is to act in the national interest of the United States of America. I believe it is in our national interest to see democracy take hold on the island of Cuba. And so we should examine our foreign policy, including all the changes that President Obama made, in that lens and through that lens.
But examine why not just reverse?
Well, as I said, there are key elements that are more important than others, so we'll look at all of them. Here's the thing people don't understand, and I've said this repeatedly. I am not against changes in U.S. policy towards Cuba. I just want to make sure that those changes are reciprocal, that they're reciprocated by the Cuban government. That was not part of what President Obama did. And I want to make sure that they are the kinds of things that help create a pathway towards democracy in Cuba. Because while Fidel Castro was 90 years old, his brother's 85. There is going to be a generational leadership change in Cuba over the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully sooner. And we need to ensure that our foreign policy towards Cuba incentivizes and makes it easier for there to be a democratic transition. That's how I would examine our foreign policy towards Cuba.
Why is this such an important issue for Americans who may not know about the history of American-Cuban relations in the Cold War?
Well, it's no longer about the Cold War. It's important for 3 reasons. Number one, Cuba continues to be a source of instability in the region. For example, historic numbers of people are fleeing the island of Cuba, putting migratory pressure on the United States. Number two, this Cuban government is anti-American. They allow the Chinese and the Russians to conduct espionage, electronic espionage and others from the island of Cuba. Number three, they harbor fugitives of American justice. There are people living on the island of Cuba who have violated American law, including those who have stolen millions of dollars from Medicare fraud in South Florida and have fled to Cuba. Those are 3 reasons right there to care about what's happening on the island of Cuba, which happens to be 90 miles from our shores, basically a neighboring country.
Let me step back and look at President-elect Trump. His position towards countries like Cuba, I want to get your sense of it, because he was asked about the U.S. force overseas, and he said our country has a lot of problems. When the world looks at how bad the United States is and then we go talk about civil liberties, I don't think we're a very good messenger. I don't know that we have a right to lecture. We're not in a position to be more aggressive. We have to fix our own mess. That seems like retreating from dealing with the kinds of problems you just outlined in Cuba. And let's speak more broadly about Syria, Russia, other countries with whom you have disagreements, and President-elect Trump doesn't seem to want to meddle.
Well, I don't know when he made that statement. I can say to you that, as I would with any other president, number one, he's been elected. I want to give him a chance to succeed. If I agree with him on a foreign policy matter, I look forward to working with his administration. If I do not agree with him on a foreign policy matter, be they a Republican or a Democrat, I'll disagree and try to offer an alternative and hopefully do what we can from the Senate to change and influence our foreign policy.
In your list of objections to Cuba, you mentioned meddling in American affairs. U.S. intelligence says that the Russians attempted to interfere in the United States election. What's your assessment of Russia efforts in the U.S. election?
If you recall, during the election, I was up for re-election, and I did not or would not talk about WikiLeaks during that period of time, because I do not, as I said, I believe it's the work of a foreign intelligence agency. I believe Americans need to know. I don't believe that they changed the outcome of the election. I want to be clear about that. But I do think that it is some of the things we saw are very reminiscent of the active measures that Russian intelligence and before that Soviet intelligence agencies used to try to undermine the government or individual politicians in foreign countries.
Should the U.S. retaliate if there's evidence the Russians were involved?
Well, again, I'm not going to speak to specifics of what the U.S. should do in response because it's an intelligence matter. All I would say is that if, in fact, there is evidence that these were active measures on the part of the Russian government. The American people deserve to know, but I want to be clear, I do not believe that in any way what they did ultimately changed the outcome of the election, but the American people need to be made aware of, in fact, there is evidence that a foreign government tried to interfere with or influence the direction of our politics.
Donald Trump is looking at his Secretary of State picks. Without getting into the personalities, what attributes should he look for in a Secretary of State?
Well, first of all, someone who is capable of being the chief diplomat of the United States, hopefully someone who has a deep-rooted commitment in human rights and a strong national security on the part of our country, who has an understanding of the complexities of the world today, and someone who understands that the world is a better place when America plays a leading role in leading the free world in confronting the challenges of the 21st century. I think he has a bevy of people to pick from. Ultimately, he has to choose someone that he's comfortable with, because he won this election. He has a right to pick someone as his Secretary of State that he feels comfortable with, and I think there are a number of qualified candidates that could fit the bill.
Senator Marco Rubio, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.